Chapter 1. Interaction with strangers requires introspection as well as consideration of certain parameters for our own safety and theirs. The strategies we employ in our interactions with strangers are heavily flawed. As humans, we have a tendency to judge others based on standards to which we would not subject ourselves. We also rely on facial expressions to evaluate the personality or temperament of a stranger without giving due regard to context. We must accurately determine the background of a stranger, aggressive or friendly, in order to have a successful relationship with them. While we may not have answers to some questions, within the short time of meeting a stranger, it helps to know that there's so much about them we do not know. This prevents us from jumping to conclusions. We tend to express a default to truth and ignore all the signs that show that someone is lying to us. Until we have indisputable evidence staring back at us, we do not trust our instincts enough to act or verify what someone has said to us. What's more interesting is that even those who are trained in the art of detecting lies, example, policemen, CIA agents, etc., are not better at detecting it than the rest of us. Keep reading to understand context and other factors that make talking to strangers easier and more beneficial. Because we do not know how to talk to strangers, what do we do when things go wrong with strangers? We blame the stranger. Malcolm Gladwell. Chapter 2. Sometimes the best conversations between strangers allow the stranger to remain themselves. In July 2015, an unfortunate scenario played out between a young African-American woman named Sandra Bland and Brian Encinia, a 30-year-old police officer. Sandra was pulled over by Encinia as she made a right turn onto the highway that rings the Prairie View campus in Houston, Texas. She was from Chicago. Encinia was courteous, initially. He told her that she did not signal a lane change. He asked her a few questions and she answered them. Bland then lit a cigarette, which Encinia asked her to put out. An altercation that led to her forceful removal and arrest followed her refusal to put out the cigarette. Bland committed suicide 3 days after being jailed. It is important to analyze, critique, and figure out what really happened by the side of the highway that day in rural Texas. The traffic stop incident happened in the middle of a time when several reports of African Americans dying at the hands of white police officers had become common. There are two factions. One side made the discussion about racism, looking down at the case from 10,000 feet. With a magnifying glass, the other side studied every aspect of the situation. What was the officer's personality like? What exactly did he do? On one hand, there was a forest, but there were no leaves. On the other hand, there were no trees and no forest. In their own way, each side was right. Prejudice and incompetence contribute significantly to social instability in the United States. Chapter 3. Throughout the majority of human history, encounters, hostile or otherwise, were rarely between strangers. In the early days, the people one met and fought with often believed in the same God, fought the same wars, and had similar cultures. But the 16th century's bloodiest conflict did not fit into any of those patterns. When Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, encountered Montezuma II, the Aztec emperor, neither side knew anything about the other. Their failure to communicate via several layers of translation culminated in a major misunderstanding, which resulted in Montezuma II's death at the hands of Cortés. There are different aspects of the stranger problem that can be investigated using different case studies taken from the news. Brock Turner, a first-year student at Stanford University in Northern California, met a woman at a party and was arrested by the end of the night. Jerry Sandusky, a former assistant football coach at Pennsylvania State University, has been found guilty of pedophilia, and the school's president and 2 top aides have been found complicit in his abuse. How did a spy spend years undetected at the highest levels of the Pentagon? How did the man who brought down hedge fund manager Bernie Madoff pull it off? What about the false conviction of the American exchange student Amanda Knox? In these instances, the parties used a series of techniques to interpret each other's terms and intentions. And something went horribly wrong in each situation. What were these strategies? Where did they come from? How do we correct them? Keep reading to find out. Chapter 4. Most times we are convinced that we know others better than they know us, and that we have insights about them that they lack. Emily Pronin and her team of psychologists conducted a study. They gave a group of people an exercise on a word completion task. They had to fill in some blank spaces. She then asked what they thought their choices said about them. The respondents believed the words they used to fill up the blank spaces were just words and not a determinant of their personalities. Cronin then gave the group other people's, perfect strangers, words. She asked the same question, and this time they completely changed their minds. People who thought the exercise had no significance were now judging strangers based on their word completion exercises. None of them seemed to realize that they had been caught in a contradiction. Emily Cronin described this phenomenon as the illusion of asymmetric insight. We judge others using standards we are not willing to hold ourselves up to. Florentino Espalaga was a Cuban spy par excellence who grew disenchanted with the former Prime Minister of Cuba, Fidel Castro, because of his self-centeredness. When Espalaga was posted to Bratislava in 1986, he decided to betray Cuba. You would expect this defection to sting, but what really sent shockwaves was what Espalaga revealed to the CIA. Practically the entire U.S. roster of secret agents inside Cuba were all working for Havana, spoon-feeding the CIA information cooked up by the Cubans themselves. If the CIA's best can be fooled so completely so many times, then what of the rest of us? Did you know the CIA has a regular practice of giving its agents lie detector tests to guard against agents acting as double agents? Chapter 5. To many of us, information gathered from personal interaction with others is quite important. Not many people knew much about Adolf Hitler. Winston Churchill came close while doing some research for a book in Munich in 1932. He and Hitler made plans to meet twice, but Hitler did not show up on both occasions. Yet, Neville Chamberlain, Churchill's predecessor, met Hitler repeatedly in the period leading to the war with the sole aim of avoiding the war. Despite the staggering evidence staring back at Chamberlain, he chose to believe that Hitler had agreed to peace. Chamberlain's negotiations with Hitler are categorized as one of the great mistakes of the Second World War. He thought he knew many details about Hitler from the little interactions he had with him. People would never hire a babysitter for their children without meeting that person first. Companies carry out very complicated recruitment processes. They maintain eye contact, take note of their behavior, and come up with conclusions. One would think that Chamberlain would have understood Hitler better with all that extra information he gathered from their interactions. No, Chamberlain never understood Hitler. We all think we possess special skills to read other people and know their intentions. We believe that we can know what other people think just by having interactions with them. We are convinced that just with the smallest clues, we can see into the heart of others. Humans hardly ever judge themselves as much as they do strangers. Perhaps this is the reason many relationships do not last a long time. Did you know? Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, and Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, never met Hitler throughout his rise. Chapter 6. Over the course of evolution, humans never developed accurate skills to detect deception. The Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, is the third arm of the Foreign Intelligence Triumvirate in the U.S. government, along with the CIA and the National Security Agency. Ana Bellis Montes worked for the DIA and won several laurels and recommendations from her superiors. Queen of Cuba was her nickname in the intelligence community. On February 24, 1996, two of the airplanes of the Hermanos al Rescate, Brothers to the Rescue, were shot down by Cuban pilots because they had been helping Cubans escape the regime of Fidel Castro. After a thorough investigation by Reg Brown, a military counterintelligence analyst, the evidence pointed to Montes as the Cuban spy who leaked the information about the movement of the airplanes. Brown, after struggling with this realization for weeks, reported his findings to a DIA counterintelligence officer named Scott Carmichael. Carmichael interviewed Montes, double-checked her alibi, and concluded that there was no way she could have been a Cuban spy. Montes had been a Cuban spy from the moment she joined the DIA. The DIA discovered the codes she used to give her dispatches to Havana in her purse just before she was arrested. She also had a shortwave radio in her bedroom, which she kept in a shoebox in her wardrobe. The most dangerous spies are rarely diabolical. The problem with spies isn't because they're smart in any way. The problem is with us. Usually, something undeniably real must happen in order for us to change our minds about anything. Chapter 7. If human beings know when they are being deceived, it would be quite useful. According to Tim Levine, professor and chair of communication studies at the University of Alabama, we get efficient communication and social coordination in exchange for being vulnerable to an occasional lie. Over the course of his career, Tim Levine has conducted the same simple experiment over and over again. He invites students to his laboratory and gives them a test. If they get the correct answers, they win some money. The aim of Levine's research was to try to find out why humans are bad at discovering lies. One would think that evolution, over these many years, should have favored people with the ability to pick up the subtle signs of deception, but it hasn't. In one of his experiments, Levine divided his tapes in half, 22 liars and 22 truth tellers. On average, the people who watched all 44 videos correctly identified the liars 56% of the time. Levine's experiment explains the truth default theory, or TDT. The truth default theory states that we typically believe someone is telling the truth until they give us reason not to believe them. One needs a trigger to snap out of the truth default mode. We fall out of this mode only when a contrary explanation becomes certain. We do not take the time to gather evidence and reach a definite conclusion. Instead, we do the opposite. We start by believing in a certain explanation, and we stop believing only when our doubts and misgivings rise to the point where we can no longer explain them away. Chapter 8. Understanding how idiosyncratic someone's emotional gestures can be is a part of getting to know them. Our strategies for dealing with strangers are wrong in so many ways, but they are also necessary in our daily interactions. For our institutions to run smoothly, we need to have processes such as the criminal justice system, recruitment process, and other human processes. As humans, we are bound to make many mistakes. It is essential that we tolerate them and try to get better at these processes. We tend to judge people's honesty based on how they carry themselves around us. We believe well-spoken, confident people with a firm handshake, who are friendly and engaging, are believable, while nervous, shifty, stammering, uncomfortable people aren't. A few years ago, research on attitudes that indicate deception was conducted. It involved thousands of people in 58 countries around the world, and 63% of those asked said the cue they mostly used to spot a liar was gaze aversion. We fail as humans to detect liars when the person's lying display the markers we use to judge truthfulness. According to Levine, we strongly believe that some nonverbal behaviors are associated with deception. We only correctly identify those whose looks match their level of truthfulness. For instance, if a liar acts as an honest person, we get confused. We keep looking to match dishonest cues with dishonest behavior. Essentially, human beings are not bad lie detectors altogether. We are only bad at detecting lies in situations where the person we're judging is mismatched. Chapter 9. Alcohol can greatly influence our ability to make decisions. Psychologists Claude Steele and Robert Josephs first discovered the myopia theory. According to them, myopia refers to the principal effect of alcohol: narrows our emotional and mental fields of vision. It creates, in their words, a state of short-sightedness in which superficially understood, immediate aspects of experience have a disproportionate influence on behavior and emotion. When alcohol is involved, the thing in the foreground becomes even more prominent, while the thing in the background becomes less important. Alcohol makes it harder to make short-term decisions, and it is even easy to forget long-term considerations. Lots of people drink when they feel sad because they believe it will uplift their spirits. This is referred to as inhibition thinking. Alcohol will unlock my good mood. But that's plainly not what happens. Sometimes alcohol cheers us up. But for example, at other times an anxious person drinks and they get more anxious. Going by the myopia theory, a person's reaction to alcohol is based on several factors. If an anxious, drunk person is at a football game surrounded by rabid fans, the excitement and drama going on around them will temporarily rid him of his worries. The game is the center of concentration, but their worries are not. But if the same person drinks in a lonely corner of a bar with nothing to distract them, they will get more depressed. Drinking exposes you to all the ills of your environment. It crowds out everything except the most immediate experiences. Chapter 10. Conflicts are a crucial part of how we form our character. Alcohol isn't an agent of revelation. It is an agent of transformation. When alcohol peels away the longer-term constraints on our behavior, it obliterates our true self. What happens to us when we get drunk is a function of the particular path the alcohol takes as it seeps through our brain tissue. The effects begin in the frontal lobes, the part of our brain that controls attention, motivation, planning, and learning. The first drink dampens activity in that region. It hits the reward centers of the brain and finds its way into the amygdala. The amygdala tells us how to react to the world around us. Alcohol also finds its way to your cerebellum, which is involved in balance and coordination. That's why you start to stumble and stagger when intoxicated. These are the predictable effects of getting drunk. But under certain, very particular circumstances, especially if you drink a lot of alcohol very quickly, something else happens. Alcohol hits the hippocampus, small sausage-like regions on each side of the brain that are responsible for forming memories about our lives. At a blood alcohol level of roughly 0.08, the legal level of intoxication, the hippocampus starts to struggle. Chapter 11. The right way to talk to strangers is with caution and humility because they might be fragile. In March 2003, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, was captured by the CIA. He was one of the most senior al-Qaeda officials ever captured. He was a hardcore guy and was nicknamed Mukhtar, which means the brain. James Mitchell and Bruce Jensen were specialists in enhanced interrogation techniques who were sent to extract information from KSM after the normal interrogation techniques had failed. Mitchell and Jensen could use only walling and sleep deprivation to get him to talk because, incredibly, waterboarding did not work on him. KSM's extraordinary confession was a triumph for Mitchell and Jensen. The man who had come to them in 2003, angry and defiant, was now willingly laying his past bare. But KSM's cooperation left a crucial question unanswered. Was what he said true? We must accept the reality that there are limits to what we can know about strangers. The truth about KSM, or Hitler, or Brian and Sinia, among other strangers mentioned earlier, is fragile. If we handle it carelessly, it will crumple under our feet. We all need to accept that the search to understand a stranger has real limits. We will never know the whole truth. We have to be satisfied with something short of that. Conclusion. Talking to strangers requires wisdom and introspection. Wisdom enables us to correctly apply what we know about the stranger in our interaction with them. Introspection is useful for the removal of sentiments and prejudice in our judgment of strangers. Whether we are on a blind date or serving as jurors in a court of law, we must actively guide against the tendency to judge others based on their facial expressions, tone of their voice, physical appearances, and skin color. Our assessment can be terribly wrong because we have not considered all the parameters necessary to make accurate judgment on the situation. We have no choice but to talk to strangers, especially in our modern, borderless world. Malcolm Gladwell. Context is another key ingredient in dealing with strangers. For example, judging actions carried out by an individual when they were drunk requires us to consider the context of drunkenness. Most of the time, we assume that alcohol simply reveals what is hidden in people. Truth is, alcohol transforms people into who they are not. Hence, they act in ways they wouldn't have if they were sober. Containing crime and stemming the tide of a suicide also requires a change of context. When we make it difficult for people to gain access to things normally used to commit suicide, there will be a sharp drop in suicide rates. When law enforcement agents identify areas where crime is concentrated and have more military presence in these areas, crime rates will reduce. To have a safer, less sentimental and fair world, we need to identify the loopholes in our dealings with strangers and plug them post-haste. A major mistake we make with strangers, the default to truth and the illusion of transparency, has to do with our inability to make sense of the stranger as an individual. But on top of those errors, we add another, which pushes our problem with strangers into crisis. We do not understand the importance of the context in which the stranger is operating. Try this. Make an effort to learn more about someone who left a bad first impression. Try not to judge them based on the things you first notice about them. Also, be more careful when dealing with people you do not know. Treat them with respect and caution.